Chapter 2. Murphy declined to ride in the Blue Beetle, my old Volkswagen Bug. The Beetle wasn't really blue, not anymore. One of the doors had been replaced with a green duplicate, the other one with white, when something with claws had shredded the originals. The hood had been slagged by fire, and my mechanic Mike had replaced it with the hood from a red vehicle. The important thing is that the Beetle runs, even if it doesn't do it very fast, and I'm comfortable with the car. Mike has declared that the VW Bug is the easiest car in the world to repair, and so that's what I drive. He keeps it running 8 or 9 days in 10. That's phenomenal. Technology tends to foul up around wizards. Flip on a light switch and it'll be the time the bulb burns out. Drive past a street light and it'll pick just then to flicker and die. Whatever can go wrong will, automobiles included. I didn't think it made much sense for Murphy to risk her vehicle when she could have taken mine, but she said she'd take her chances. She didn't speak as she drove her Saturn down JFK out toward Rosemont. I watched her, uncomfortable as we went. She was in a hurry, taking a few too many chances cutting in and out of traffic, and I put on my seatbelt. At least we weren't on her motorcycle. "Murph," I asked her, "where's the fire?" She glanced aside at me. "I want you out there before some other people show up." "Press?" I couldn't quite keep a nasty slur out of the word. She shrugged. "Whoever." I frowned at her, but she didn't say anything else, which seemed typical. Murphy didn't speak much to me anymore. We rode the rest of the way in silence, exited the JFK, and pulled into the parking lot of a half-completed little strip mall. We got out of the car. A jet came in low, heading for O'Hare International Airport only a few miles to the west. I squinted at it for a moment and then frowned at Murphy as a uniformed officer led us toward a building surrounded by police tape. There was an abundance of light, the moon overhead bright silver and almost a completely round circle. I cast an enormous gangly shadow as I walked, my duster flapping around my legs. It towered beside Murphy's far smaller shadow ahead of me. "Murphy," I said, "aren't we outside Chicago city limits?" "Yeah," Murphy said shortly. "Then aren't we out of your jurisdiction, technically? People need help wherever they can get it, Dresden, and the last several killings happened in Chicago, so we want to take a look at this firsthand. I already worked things out with the local force. It's not really an issue." "Several killings," I said. "Several? As in more than one?" "Murphy, slow down." But she didn't. Instead, she led me into a roomy building that proved to be under construction, though all the exterior work was finished. Some of the windows were still covered with board. I didn't see the sign on the building's front doors until I got close. "The Varsity," I said, reading it. "I thought Marcone burned it down last spring." "Mm-hmm," Murphy said, glancing at me over her shoulder. "Relocated and rebuilding. Chicago's resident crime lord, Gentleman Johnny Marcone, was the robber baron of the mean streets. He kept all the rough business inside the city proper, leaving his legitimate interests out in the suburbs, like here in Rosemont. Last spring, when I had confronted him in his club, a previous incarnation of the Varsity, about a deadly new drug on the streets, the place had wound up burning to the ground. After the whole mess was over, word got out that the drug dealer I had taken out had been Marcone's enemies and that I had nuked him at the crime lord's request. I hadn't refuted the rumor. It was easier to let people talk than to force Marcone to make an issue of things. Inside the building, the floors were rough, unfinished. Someone had turned on a couple of halogen work lights, and they cast the interior into brilliant, clear white light. There was drywall dust everywhere. There were a few card tables set up, with workmen's tools left out on them in places. Plastic buckets of paint, tarps, and a sack of new paintbrushes waited for use off to one side. I didn't notice the blood until Murphy put her arm out in front of me to keep me from walking into it. "Wake up, Dresden," she said. Her voice was grim. I stopped and looked down. Blood. A lot of blood. It began near my feet where a long splatter had reached out like an arm from a drowning man, staining the dusty floor with scarlet. My eyes followed the path of the long bloodstain back to a pool, maybe an eighth of an inch deep, surrounding a mound of ripped cloth and torn meat that must have been the corpse. My stomach quailed, threatening to eject the bites of steak I'd taken earlier that evening, but I forced it down. I walked in a complete circle around the body, keeping my distance. The corpse was, I guess, that of a male in his 30s. He had been a large man with a short, spiky haircut. He had fallen onto his side, facing away from me, his arms curled up toward his head, his legs up towards his vitals. A weapon. A little automatic pistol lay 7 or 8 feet away, uselessly out of the victim's reach. I walked around the corpse until I could see the face. Whatever had killed him, it hadn't been human. His face was gone, simply torn away. Something had ripped his lips off. I could see his blood-stained teeth. His nose had been torn all the way up one side, and part of it dangled toward the floor. His head was misshapen, as though some enormous pressure had been put upon his temple, warping his skull in. His eyes were gone, torn out of his head, bitten out. There were the ragged slash marks of fangs all around the edges of the sockets. I closed my eyes tightly. I took a deep breath, another, a third. That didn't help. The body stank, a sickly sewer smell that rose up from the torn innards. My stomach wanted to roll up out of my throat, out of my mouth, and onto the floor. I could remember the other details, even with my eyes closed, and cataloged them neatly for later reference. The victim's jackets and shirt had been torn to bloody ribbons along his forearms and defensive wounds. His hands and arms were a mass of pulped, ripped meat, the palms and fingers slashed to ragged lumps. The curl of his body hid his abdomen from me, but that was where the blood was pooling from, spreading out like ink from a spilled bottle. The stench only confirmed that he had been eviscerated. I turned away from the corpse and opened my eyes, staring down at the floor. "Harry?" Murphy said from the far side of the body. The note of hardness that had been in her voice all evening was absent. She hadn't moved while I had done my cursory examination. "I recognize him," I said. "At least, I think I do. You'll need to check dental records or something to be sure." I could hear her frown in her words. "Yeah? Who was he?" "I don't know his name. I always called him Spike for the haircut. He was one of Johnny Marcone's bodyguards." Murphy was quiet for a moment, then said succinctly, "Shit." "What, Murph?" I looked back at her, without looking down at Spike's mangled remains. Murphy's face was set in concern for me, her blue eyes gentle. I saw her wipe the expression away as quickly as a shadow crosses the floor, a smoothing of lines that left her features neutral. I guess she hadn't expected me to turn to her. "Take a look around a little more," she said. "Then we'll talk." "What am I looking for?" I asked her. "You'll know it," she said, then added in a whisper that I think she didn't intend me to hear, "I hope." I turned back to my work and looked around the room. Off to one side, one of the windows was broken. Near it was a table lying askew on the floor, its legs warped and bent. I walked over to it. Broken glass littered the ground around the collapsed table. Since the glass was on the inside of the building, something must have come in through the window. There was blood on several of the broken pieces of glass. I picked up one of the larger ones and frowned at it. The blood was dark red and not yet wholly dried. I took a white handkerchief from my pocket, folded the shard of glass into it, and then slipped it into the pocket of my duster. I rose and paced over the floor, my eyes downcast, studying the dust. In one spot it was rubbed almost clean off the floor, as though a struggle had taken place there without blood being spilled. In another spot, where the halogen lamps didn't quite reach, there was a pool of silver moonlight below a window. I knelt down beside it. In the center of the pool was a paw print, in the dust, a paw print almost as big as my spread hand, canine. Dots at the tips of the paw spoke of heavy nails, almost claws. I looked up through the window at the rounded silver shape of the almost full moon. "Oh, hell," I breathed. "Oh, hell." Murphy came toward me and watched me silently for a moment, waiting. I licked my lips, stood up, and turned to her. "You've got problems." "No kidding. Talk to me, Dresden." I nodded, then pointed at the window. "The attacker probably came in there. He went after the victim, attacked him, got the gun away from him, and killed him. It's the attacker's blood on the window. They struggled a while over there by that clean spot maybe, and Spike made a break for the door. He didn't make it there. He got torn to pieces first." I turned toward Murphy, looking down at her solemnly. "You've had other murders happen in the same way, probably about 4 weeks ago, when the moon was last full. Those were the other killings you were talking about." Murphy glanced at my face for a moment, keeping her eyes off mine, and nodded her head. "Yeah, 4 weeks ago, almost exactly. But no one else picked up the full moon angle, just me." "Uh-huh. Then you should see this too," I said. I led her over to the window and showed her the paw print in the dust beneath it. She regarded it in silence. Harry, she said after a minute, are there such things as werewolves? She brushed a strand of hair back from her cheek, a small and oddly vulnerable gesture. She folded her arms over her stomach as though she were cold. I nodded. Yeah, not like you see in the movies, but yeah, I figure that's what you got going here. She drew in a deep breath. All right, then. All right. What can you tell me? What do I need to know? I opened my mouth to speak, but I didn't get a chance to say anything. There was a brief bout of shouting outside, and then the front doors of the building banged open. Murphy tensed, and I saw her mouth set in a hard little line. Her back straightened, and she stopped hugging herself, putting her fists on her hips. God damn it, she said. How do those assholes get everywhere so fast? I stepped forward so that I could see. A quartet of people in suits came through the door, fanned out in an almost military diamond formation. The man in front was not quite as tall as me, but still very tall, 6 feet and 3 or 4 inches. His hair was jet black, as were his eyebrows, while his eyes were a shade of gray as pale as wood smoke. His dark blue suit fit him well, and I had the impression that it concealed an athletic build in spite of the fact that he had obviously seen more than 4 decades. A blue identification badge reading FBI in huge, obnoxious letters dangled from one lapel. Secure the scene, he said, his voice deep, tense. Lieutenant Murphy, what the hell are you doing on a crime scene out of your jurisdiction? Nice to see you again, Agent Denton, Murphy said in a flat tone. You get around fast. I told you that you weren't welcome on this investigation, Denton said, his words crisp. His gray eyes flashed, and I saw a vein bulge rhythmically on his forehead. His gaze shifted to me. Who is this? Hair, I started to say, but Murphy's snort cut over my words. No one, she said. She flashed me a look that said very clearly to shut up. That annoyed the hell out of me. Harry Dresden, I said, making the words loud and clear. Murphy and I exchanged a glare. Ah, Denton said. The charlatan. I've read about you in the Tribune. His clear, tense gaze returned to Murphy. You and your psychic friend might want to step out of the way. There's police work being done here, the real kind, where we worry about fingerprints, fibers, genetic matches, silly things like that. Murphy's eyes narrowed along with mine, but if the twin glares affected Denton, it didn't show in his face. Murphy and Denton had a brief staring match, her fury against his steely intensity. Agent Ben, Denton called. A woman, not quite in her 30s, with a shoulder-length mane of hair gone prematurely gray, turned toward us from her intent contemplation of the corpse. She had olive skin, deep green eyes, and a thin, severe mouth. She walked toward us with a sort of hard-muscled sensuality, moving like someone who's capable of being fast and dangerous when necessary. Of the 4 FBI agents who had entered the room, she was the only one obviously sporting a weapon. Her jacket was unbuttoned, and I could see the straps of her shoulder rig against the white of her shirt. Yes, sir, Ben said. Her voice was very quiet. Her eyes took up a position midway between Murphy and me, looking at neither of us while watching us both. Please escort these 2 civilians, Denton stressed the word, from the crime scene. Ben nodded once, but didn't say anything in reply, just waited. I gathered myself to go, but paused. Murphy planted her feet and lowered her arms casually to her sides. I recognized the stubborn outthrust angle of her jaw. She had that look she got when she was behind on points in one of her martial arts tournaments. Murphy was ready to fight. Damn. I had to get her cooled off before we could accomplish anything. Murphy, I said quietly, can we talk outside? Like hell, Murphy said. Whoever this killer is, he's knocked off 6 people in the last month. I'm here and I'm after this man. The Rosemont Department has given me their consent to be here. Murphy glared up at Ben. The FBI agent had her by a considerable margin of reach and muscle. I saw Ben's eyes narrow, her shoulders grow tenser. Do you have that in writing? Denton demanded. The vein in his head throbbed more angrily. And do you really think you want me reporting this to your superiors, Lieutenant? Don't push me, Denton, Murphy said, her voice hot. I winced. Look, Murphy, I said. I put a hand on her shoulders. Let's just go outside for a minute. I squeezed, just a little. Murphy turned back to me. She chanced a brief glance up at my eyes and then relaxed a little, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her features. She started to ease down, and I let my breath out. I definitely didn't want this dissolving into violence. It wouldn't accomplish anything. Get them out of here, Denton said, and there was a note to his voice that I didn't like. Ben didn't give us any warning. She just moved, fast and hard, stepping towards Murphy and flicking some sort of martial arts blow I wasn't familiar with towards her temple. There was a quick blur of motion. Murphy's hands got there before the blow landed, and she turned, somehow levering Ben's weight off her legs and slamming the gray-maned woman hard into a wall. Ben's expression went from shocked and surprised to furious in the space of a half-second. Her hand dipped into her jacket, hesitated for another half-second, and then resumed motion. She drew her gun with an expert's precision, smooth and quick without seeming hurried. Her green eyes blazed. I threw myself at Murphy, colliding with her and driving her over and down as the gun went off, louder than a close clap of thunder in the interior of the half-finished restaurant. We landed in a heap on the dusty floor. "Ben!" Denton shouted. He lunged for her, heedless of the gun, and got between the armed woman and us. I could hear him talking to her in a low, urgent voice. "You crazy bitch!" I shouted. "What's the matter with you?" The two other FBI guys and several patrol officers from outside came running. Murphy grunted and elbowed me in the gut urgently. I grunted back and moved off of her. Both of us climbed to our feet unhurt. "What the hell happened?" demanded one of the officers, an older man with thinning gray hair. Denton turned toward the officer, calm and cool. "Misfire. There was a misunderstanding and Agent Ben's weapon accidentally discharged." The officer rubbed at his scalp and eyed Murphy. "Is that true, Lieutenant?" "Like hell," I said. I pointed a finger at Ben. "This crazy bit—" Murphy jammed an elbow into my stomach and glared at me. "That's true," Murphy said, while I rubbed at my gut. "It happened just like Agent Denton said. An accident." I stared at her. "Murph, give me a break. This woman—" "Had an accident with her weapon," Murphy said, voice hard. "Could have happened to anyone." Murphy turned her glare on the aging officer, and he blinked mildly at her, then shrugged. Denton turned back towards us and studied Murphy intently for a second. Then he nodded. "Raj, George, why don't you two make sure the lieutenant is all right and help her to her car?" Sure, Phil," said a skinny kid with red hair, big ears, and freckles. Mr. Dresden, Lieutenant Murphy, why don't we go outside and get some air? I'm Roger Harris, and this is Agent Wilson." The other FBI guy, a bulky, overweight man in his late 40s, his hair receding and his gut overhanging his belt, just beckoned us to follow him and walk towards the door. Murphy glared at Denton for a moment, then spun on her heel and stalked after the bulky Wilson. I followed her. "I can't believe that. You all right?" "Why the hell didn't you tell them what she did?" I asked Murphy, sotto voce. "That bitch," Murphy said back, not nearly as quiet. "She tried to sucker punch me." "She tried to ventilate you, Murph," I countered. Murphy let out a breath between her teeth, but kept walking. I glanced back at the room behind us and saw Spike's torn and mangled body being surrounded by more police tape. Forensics had arrived, and the team was getting set to sweep the room. Denton was kneeling down beside Ben, who had her face in her hands and looked as though she was weeping. Denton was watching me, his gray eyes calculating and expressionless, filing me away under, tall, slender, dark hair, dark eyes, hawkish features, no visible scars. I stared at him for a minute and got a hunch, a solid intuition of which I was completely sure. Denton was hiding something. He knew something, and he wasn't talking. Don't ask me how I knew it, but something about him, about the way the veins bulged in his forehead, or the way he held his neck so stiffly, made me think so. The kid Harris said. I blinked and turned towards him. He opened the door for Murphy and me, and we walked outside. "Maybe give Deborah some slack. She's really stressed out about these Lobo killings. She hasn't slept much the past month. She knew one of the guys who got killed. She's been tense ever since." "Shut up, Harris," the overweight Agent Wilson said, his tone disgusted. "Just shut up." He turned towards the two of us and said in a calm voice, "Get the hell out of here. I don't want to see either of you around a scene that isn't on your turf, Lieutenant Murphy. Internal Affairs has enough to do, don't you think?" He turned and went back into the building. The red-headed kid gave us an apologetic, awkward smile and then hurried to catch up with the overweight agent. I saw him shoot a glance back at me, his expression thoughtful. Then he was gone. The door shut, leaving Murphy and me on the outside, away from the investigation and the evidence at the crime scene. I looked up through the clear night at the almost full moon. Werewolves jumping through windows at gangster lackeys and unfinished restaurants. A mangled corpse in the middle of a blood-drenched floor. Berserk FBI field agents drawing guns and shooting to kill. A little kung fu, a little John Wayne, and a few casual threats. So far, I thought, my nerves jangling. Just one more night on the job.